Imagine a solemn family portrait in Salem in 1898. The father, the mother, the children, all standing silently before the camera. But when the picture was developed, something inexplicable emerged. One member of the portrait had all but disappeared, leaving only a faint hand resting on the child's shoulder. The story begins with Catherine O'Brien, a young Irish woman with a tragic past. The sudden death of her family, her haunting survival, and her emigration to America. It all seemed like a new beginning. But the past would not let her go. Invisible voices, figures only Catherine could see, followed her from her native Ireland to the sleepy town of Salem. What really happened during that fateful photo shoot? Was it a technical error or evidence of a soul slipping away from the real world? And where did Catherine O'Brien go after leaving that mysterious photo? Let me slowly follow the traces in tonight's story. A family photograph from 1898. At first glance, it seemed perfectly normal. 5 people in a Victorian living room, all solemn and upright, as in portrait of the time. The father, Thomas Whitmore, stood behind his wife, Mary, and 3 children gathered around him. A familiar scene, seemingly nothing out of the ordinary, but in October 2024, while conducting a routine appraisal of an estate in Salem, Massachusetts, genealogist Sarah Mitchell stumbled upon a detail that would leave every historian baffled. When she examined the photograph under a magnifying glass, there was something inexplicable, a hand. A hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest child, Margaret, who was only 6 years old. The problem was, there was no one standing behind the frame, only 5 people. No 6th. So whose hand was that? Sarah Mitchell, with more than 15 years of experience studying vintage photography, was used to all the usual errors, double exposure, broken glass scratches. But this time, she insisted it couldn't have been a random mistake. The hand was so obvious, so intentional, as if it had actually rested on the child's shoulder at that moment. Starting from that strange detail, an investigation gradually revealed not a ghost story, but traces of a tragedy forgotten by history. The house's seller, Eleanor Whitmore, then 89, confirmed that the photo had always been a family mystery. My grandmother always said there were 6 people in the picture, she whispered to Mitchell. But one person is missing. The missing person was Catherine O'Brien, Mary Whitmore's sister, an Irish immigrant who had lived with the family since 1897 to serve as governess and babysitter. According to records, Catherine was definitely present the day the photo was taken. But when the photograph was developed, she disappeared from Salem, never to be seen again. This story, Mitchell soon realized, was not just a disappearance, but also a mirror of a little-known layer of history, the lives of Irish immigrant women in New England in the late 19th century. In the Whitmore family archives, Mitchell found traces of a model house in Salem in the 1890s. Thomas was a shipping agent taking advantage of his maritime connections, and Mary, a native of County Cork, Ireland, maintained contact with her homeland, sending money and helping relatives come to America. By 1897, after a tragedy at home, Mary sponsored her younger sister Catherine to live with her. Diaries and accounts kept by Eleanor, a descendant of the family, show that Catherine took a job as a governess, earning $8 a month with room and board, a rare treat at the time. But in Mary's account, Catherine was more than a maid. She was a part of the family, beloved by her grandchildren, and unusually gifted at caring. There were signs, though, that something was amiss. Catherine often bought extra food, claiming it was for the little ones. When questioned, she became nervous mentioning the names Patrick and Molly, names completely unfamiliar to the Whitmores. The notes from the family doctor Samuel Adams added to the grim picture. In August 1898, Catherine collapsed during a meal. The doctor diagnosed her with severe melancholia and nervous fatigue, possibly the result of unresolved grief and brain fever. And then, on October 15, the Whitmores decided to have their official portrait taken. A special occasion, since the $12 fee paid to the famous photographer Herman Blackwood was no small investment. In her letters, Catherine expressed her excitement, seeing it as an opportunity to send a photograph back to Ireland that would represent her new life in America. But instead of pride, the photograph revealed something that no one in her family or historians had ever imagined. How bitter! Because instead of bringing comfort, the photograph, after being developed, became the final spark pushing Catherine into the most serious crisis. The person who took that portrait, Man Blackwood, was the most famous photographer in Salem in the late 19th century. Every composition, every light frame was taken care of with cold precision. In the records of the Salem Historical Society, the remaining records show an extremely careful photographer, rarely making mistakes. And that is why the incident related to the Whitmore family made him more confused than ever. In a letter to his colleague William Morse in Boston, dated October 22, 1898, Blackwood wrote, "I am facing the most incomprehensible situation in my 20 years of work. The portrait of the Whitmore family has created an incident that cannot be described otherwise than the almost complete disappearance of one subject from the final image." He took meticulous notes, large format camera, 30-second exposure, perfectly standard, natural light from the window adjusted by a reflector, no sign of error. Experts today like Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a historian of 19th century photography at Boston University, confirmed that there was nothing wrong with Blackwood's method and equipment. It was almost impossible for a figure to disappear, but their hand to remain visible. Blackwood, in desperation, tried every explanation. Camera failure, mishandled glass, chemical contamination, timed exposure. He even returned to the Whitmore house, set up the same lighting as that day, and every subsequent test shot was perfect. After weeks, the only conclusion he could come to protect his reputation was that Catherine O'Brien had moved during the exposure, but somehow her hand remained in place. A possibility that was both plausible and unsettling. Today, photo analysts agree with that theory, but also admit that the circumstances that produced such an eerie effect are so rare as to be nearly impossible to replicate. While the photography world debated the mistake, the Immigration Bureau archives revealed a different, more harrowing story. Catherine O'Brien arrived at Ellis Island on March 12, 1897, aboard the ship Celtic from Queenstown, Ireland. But her trip was not paid for by her own savings, but by the County Cork Relief Fund, a fund for families who had just suffered a tragedy. Irish newspapers at the time reported. The Cork Examiner, February 28, 1897, reported a terrible fire in the village of Ballycotton. In the blaze, Patrick O'Brien, his wife Bridget, and their two young children, Patrick Jr. 8 and Molly 6, were killed. Only one person survived Catherine, then 23, who happened to be visiting a neighbor. The church records of St. Coleman contain a note by Father Michael Walsh, haunting. To this day, Miss Catherine O'Brien is still struggling to come to terms with the loss of her family. She often says that she still has responsibilities to look after Patrick and Molly. She has been seen many times clearing the table and preparing their meals as if they were still sitting there. The village records of Ballycotton, kept by the local almshouse, tell of Catherine being seen buying food and supplies for 4 people while she lived alone. Neighbors whispered that they had seen her talking to empty spaces, believing that her dead loved ones were still sitting somewhere nearby. Dr. Patricia Hennessy, a historian specializing in Irish immigration and trauma, explains that Catherine's behavior was consistent with what we now call complicated grief disorder. The loss of her entire family in a violent event, combined with the torment of surviving, kept her in a reality where death was never accepted. The parish priest Michael Walsh wrote in the church register that the whole community sympathized, but then had to admit Catherine needed care beyond the small village's means. The Irish Relief Fund had raised money and sent her to America, hoping that the distance and the love of her sister Mary would help to heal the wound. But what no one expected was that the pain would follow her across the ocean and become more and more evident in her life in Salem. The first year in America seemed like a success story. Letters in the Whitmore archives show that Catherine assimilated quickly. She became a governess, a housekeeper loved by the children and trusted by Mary. In her 1897 diary, Mary wrote, "Catherine brought life to our home." The children were fascinated by her Irish songs and stories, and Thomas spoke daily of how much easier the housework was because of her. However, the subtle signs of darkness still appeared. Essex merchant records also show that Catherine frequently purchased more for children's clothing, household items, and more than the family actually needed. Dr. Samuel Adams, who had been monitoring the Whitmore family's health, was first called in to examine Catherine in November 1897. He found her physically well but mentally fatigued and depressed. Medical notes referred to nervous exhaustion and persistent melancholy. In 1898, her condition worsened. Records from St. Mary's Church show that Catherine attended daily mass, sat for hours in prayer, and sometimes whispered to a space beside her as if someone were listening. Father Patrick O'Brien, a cousin but no blood relative, made a note in the church book that he was concerned about her mental health. In the Salem City archives, police records contain some strange reports Catherine was spotted wandering the square at night, apparently tending to invisible children. One September evening, Officer Michael Sullivan reported caught Miss O'Brien setting out a picnic for several children, but she was there all alone. When questioned, Catherine insisted that Patrick and Molly were hungry and she had to feed them. The Whitmores, in letters that remain, reveal their growing confusion and anxiety. They sought advice from physicians and priests, but the medical knowledge of the time could only attribute everything to Irish temperament or female hysteria. No solution was forthcoming. By October 1898, the atmosphere in the house had become oppressive. In business correspondence, Thomas complained of the mental toll, and Mary wrote in her diary of her grief at seeing her sister struggle with invisible demons. And so, they decided on a photograph. A family portrait session, as a distraction, as a small joy to send back to Ireland that Catherine was living peacefully happily. October 15th of that year opened like a typical autumn morning in Salem. Herman Blackwood arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, carrying a large format camera and glass slides. In his appointment book, he noted every step. The living room was neatly arranged. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes. The natural light from the large windows, adjusted by mirrors and white sheets. Everything was perfect, at least until the moment the shutter closed. The camera was mounted on a heavy wooden stand, angled to capture the entire Whitmore family. According to photographer Herman Blackwood, Catherine O'Brien was initially cooperative, even pleased to be included in the portrait. She was positioned behind little Margaret Whitmore, her hands gently resting on the child's shoulders, a common position for secondary members in formal family portraits of the time. But later statements from the Whitmores in police files tell a different story. Maury Whitmore said that Catherine kept turning from side to side, speaking to the empty spaces as if giving instructions to invisible children. Molly, stand still. Patrick, keep your back straight. She acted as if she were arranging for 2 extra members of the family who were not actually in the room. Blackwood was patient, but could not hide his confusion. In a private deposition a few days later, Thomas Whitmore added that Catherine had kept the photographer waiting while she adjusted Patrick's collar and smoothed Molly's skirt. Children who were all she could see. What was supposed to be a half-hour session turned into nearly 2 hours as Catherine painstakingly arranged the silhouettes no one else could see. Blackwood, with the composure of a professional photographer, began the exposure while everyone, at least those present, was in position. The wet plate recorded for 30 seconds without any technical problems. The family paid immediately upon completion. But 3 days later, when the photo was developed, the impossible was revealed. Catherine O'Brien had completely disappeared from the frame, leaving only a faint trace of her hand on Margaret's shoulder. When Blackwood delivered the photo on October 18, 1898, he intended to explain it as a technical error. But the Whitmore family's reaction was far beyond expectations, especially Catherine's. In Mary Whitmore's shuddering diary entry, she describes Catherine screaming, pointing to the empty space in the photograph, insisting that Patrick and Molly were clearly there. When the family explained that she was barely visible, Catherine collapsed. Dr. Samuel Adams was called in immediately. A report to the Essex Medical Society noted that Catherine fell into a state of severe nervous shock, completely losing touch with reality. She became almost immobile, sitting for hours beside the photograph, whispering to the empty spaces, gently tracing the invisible faces of the children she believed were real. The Reverend Patrick O'Brien from St. Mary's Parish was also called in to comfort her. In his report to the bishop, he wrote, "Catherine seemed to exist in 2 worlds, one present where the children were dead, and another where they were still alive, depending on her." The desperation was evident in Thomas Whitmore's letters as he discussed sending Catherine to Danvers Psychiatric Hospital. But in the end, Catherine made her own decision. On the night of October 18th, she hastily packed up a few belongings, leaving a note, "I must take Patrick and Molly to a safe place where people can see them as I have. Thank you for your kindness, but we cannot stay here." The next morning, Catherine O'Brien disappeared from Salem, leaving behind a mysterious photograph and a family forever changed by the horrific memory of children who did not exist. The Whitmores never heard from Catherine again. In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, they embarked on a long, relentless search that lasted for months. Thomas Whitmore sent letters to police stations across New England, and Maury appealed to Irish groups and Catholic churches, hoping Catherine had found her way to her countrymen and found a safe haven. In the files kept in the Salem City Archives, police officer Patrick Murphy, no relation to Father O'Brien, painted a grim picture of Catherine. Testimonies from neighbors, friends, and local merchants all pointed to her becoming erratic in the weeks before her disappearance. On October 17th, Catherine withdrew her small savings, $47, and asked for change. A clear sign of a secret trip. The next morning at Salem Station, ticket agent Michael O'Sullivan testified that he had sold a young woman who looked very much like Catherine. Not just one but 3 tickets, 1 for adults and 2 for children. He jokingly asked, "Where are the children?" To which the woman smiled, pointed to the space beside her and whispered, "They're shy afraid of strangers." He assumed she was buying for someone else, so he went through with the paperwork. But one wonders, who were those children? In Boston, the police took over the search. Catherine had indeed sought refuge in the Irish neighborhood of South Boston, taking refuge in the boarding house of St. Augustine Church. Father Thomas Murphy recorded that she had lived there for several months, but had become increasingly withdrawn into her own world, preparing meals for 3, even when she was alone, spending her last coins on children's clothes, and frequently whispering to people no one else could see. By March 1899, concerned about Catherine's condition, Father Murphy had called in Dr. James Whitman, a psychiatrist. His report, still in the Massachusetts medical records, is the clearest account of Catherine. He wrote, "The patient suffered from chronic melancholia, accompanied by delusions. She had constructed an alternate reality in which Patrick and Molly were still alive and completely dependent on her care. The doctor recommended that Catherine be taken to McLean Hospital, which was considered the most modern of its time. But she disappeared again before arrangements could be made. On March 19th, a dock worker, Timothy Sullivan, reported seeing a young woman resembling Catherine standing on the long wharf overlooking the water. She was waving her arms, encouraging someone who appeared to be frightened children, but there was no one else there. When Mr. Sullivan asked, the woman simply turned, smiled, and walked into the thick fog and disappeared. No subsequent search yielded any results. On April 4th, 1899, Catherine O'Brien was officially declared missing. One name among thousands of immigrants swallowed up by the cold streets of the late 19th century. Among the remaining relics was a letter never sent to her sister Mary. The handwriting was gentle and shaky. "Please understand, I must take Patrick and Molly where we can be together. They have waited patiently for me to find a place for our family." Catherine's final letter ended with the trembling words, "Tell the photographer that his camera has captured the truth. I am disappearing from this world because I belong somewhere else where the children I loved are still alive and still need me." From that moment on, Catherine O'Brien's fate faded into the mists of history. But her story, more than 125 years later, offers us a rare glimpse into the emotional pain suffered by many Irish immigrants. People who were not only fleeing poverty, but also carrying their own deep tragedies. Today's scholars and experts still look to the eerie photograph as both a technical and psychological example. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a photography historian at Boston University, suggests that Catherine's partial disappearance may have been caused by the movement of the camera. Victorian cameras required the subject to remain still for 30 seconds. A tilt of the head, a turn of the body, while the hand remained on Margaret's shoulder, could have produced that same eerie effect. But technique is only part of the story. Dr. Patricia Hennessy places Catherine's story in the broader context of 19th century mental health. The sudden and violent death of her entire family left Catherine in what we now call complex bereavement disorder, accompanied by profound psychological trauma. At the time, medicine could not understand, much less cure. The photograph, eventually donated by the Whitmore family to the Salem Historical Society, became a relic, part memory, part reminder. Researcher Sarah Mitchell has brought the story back to light so that future generations can see more clearly the price people pay when the past refuses to leave them. And Elena Whitmore, a descendant now, in her 90s, sighs in retrospect. For more than a century, we considered the photograph a mere family oddity. Now we understand that it was evidence of a tragedy. A young girl so devastated that she no longer had enough room to fully exist in this world. The story of Catherine O'Brien is not just a disappearance. It is a scar between memory and reality, between the narrow view of 1890 science and the harsh truth of the human soul. The photograph to this day is still there, as a milestone when pain not only lives in the heart, but is also permanently imprinted on the photographic plate where Catherine seems to have stood between two worlds.